Recently, there has been a Harris poll which asked the question, how many Americans are happy? And the Harris poll results show that 2 out of every 3 Americans are unhappy. 2 out of every 3 Americans are unhappy. Does that come as a surprise to you? 2 out of 3 are unhappy. There are a number of causes, and one of the causes is loneliness. Loneliness, which is caused by fewer long-term, depthful relationships. Loneliness is caused by a lack of long-term, depthful relationships. How to be happy. There's an old song some years ago. It was something like, I beg your pardon, I never promised you a rose garden. Remember that one? And it's very true. The Lord never did promise us a rose garden. And yet, the Lord wants us to find inner peace. Amidst the chances and changes of life, the hills and the valleys of life, the Lord wants us to be at peace, to find an inner happiness, an inner serenity. The gospel today talks about, I think, the pathway to peace and to happiness. And you could say it includes 2 words, 2 dynamics in order to be happy. Detachment and attachment. Detachment and attachment. In this gospel, Jesus sends his disciples out 2 by 2, and he says, don't be too concerned about what you have to take along. Take along just the basics, the minimum, and stay with other people. In that gospel, the Lord is saying, through life, don't carry excess baggage. A lot of us carry excess baggage. In other words, a lot of things that we've cluttered up our life with that really weigh us down. And one of the things, I think, is an excessive attachment to things. An excessive attachment to things. And the Lord is saying, you have to have a basic detachment in order to be free enough to travel through life with a certain amount of inner peace. You have to be detached from those things that clutter up your heart, the things that clutter up your life, the things that you make so important but are really weighing you down. Be detached from those and attached to God, first of all, and to the other people that he sends into your life. Detachment from excessive concern about gadgetry and things and frenetic and frantic activity that keeps us swirling around like we're in a cyclone. You meet yourself coming and going. The Lord is saying, slow down, live a simpler life, and be basically detached from those things that really don't count in the long run. What counts in the long run is your relationship to God and your relationship to the people that he sent into your life. In the end, that's all we have. That's all we have in the end. When we pass through the portals of death from this life to the other next, you're not going to take one gadget with you. Neither am I. The only thing you're going to take with you is your relationship with God and the relationship with the people that you've had here that hopefully we'll be able to resume when we all get to heaven. The Lord is calling us today, I think, to recognize that we sometimes distort things to the point where we instead of using things and loving people, we love things and use people. Instead of loving people and using things, we love things and use people. Distorted mentality. A simpler life means to recognize that we have to love people and use the things that God has given us, but to keep them in perspective. I grew up here on the old South Side. And there's a lot to commend for the old South Side, not because it's a case of nostalgia, but because there are a lot of elements of the old South Side which unfortunately are no longer as prevalent as they once were. In the old South Side, life revolved around 2 things, basically. God and your family and the people that God sent you into your life. God and the people that he sent into your life. relationship was what was most important. You work to live, not live to work. Because what was most important was what went on in this parish and the extended parish family life, which extended into the neighborhoods. A simpler life, I think largely detached from an excessive concern about material things or gadgetry. I think people are absorbed with a concern for gadgetry today. Technology and gadgetry have their place, but I think it's occupying too much of people's hearts. And so we don't connect as well as we once did with God or with those people that God has sent us. We've complicated our lives by using people and loving things instead of the other way around. Someone once put it this way: if you take the word joy, if you want to have inner happiness and inner peace or inner joy, you have to recognize the three letters in the word joy. J-O-Y stand for three things. Putting Jesus first, J. O, others second. And Y, standing for yourself third. If we keep those things in perspective and in order, we'll find a pathway to inner peace, because it teaches us attachment and detachment. Jesus first, others second, and ourself and our own agendas and our own need for self-medication, which often leads us to addictions. Putting ourselves last and those other things first, I think will move us along that pathway to inner happiness. J-O-Y, Jesus, others, and you. There's a fable, which I think says it best, talks about what occupies your heart. What occupies the space within our hearts? Is it oriented to God and to others, or something else? The story is, it's a fable about a rich man who lived in Israel, and he lived in a tent. He was a shepherd. And he was very, very wealthy, this shepherd. He had a tent that was made of silk, and the pegs that are the spikes that held the tent in the ground were solid gold. Solid gold pegs to hold the tent in the ground. And the story goes, a poor shepherd approached one day with an old wooden begging bowl that was cracked and warped. And he saw the wealth of this rich man, and he begged the rich man, but he also scolded the rich man for all of his conspicuous wealth, having gold spikes to hold down his tent. He was that rich. Nevertheless, the wealthy man served him a meal and let him stay. And the next day, the wealthy man said, "Let us go to Jerusalem to worship in the temple of God, to worship God there." So the next morning they left, staff in hand. The wealthy man left everything behind, his tent with the gold spikes and everything else he left behind, without so much as a care or complaint. Short way down the road to Jerusalem, the poor man said to the wealthy man, "I forgot my begging bowl. I have to get back and get my begging bowl. It was old and warped," but he wanted it anyway. The rich man said, "I left all my wealth behind me without a care or concern, and you're so attached to that cup, that begging cup, that you'll leave everything behind, not even going to Jerusalem to worship God. You'll go back to get that old cup. You scolded me," the wealthy man said, "for my wealth, but I want to assure you, the golden tent pegs to which you objected were driven into the earth, not into my heart." The golden pegs were driven into the earth, not to my heart. That poor man, although he was poor, was possessed by his possession in his heart, whereas the wealthy man was detached and attached to God. What's driven into your heart? What's driven into my heart? What attachment do I have, or what attachments do I have that are so important to me that it eclipses the importance of God first and others second and me last? What would I refuse to give up if God said, "I want you to give this up"? What would be so difficult, almost impossible, for me to say, "Yes, Lord, I'll give this up," if he asked for it? That may be the thing that's holding you captive. That which is taking up room in your heart, not leaving enough space for God and for the relationships that He sends us. Attached, detached, the way to happiness. The rich man had golden pegs driven into the earth, but not into his heart. What counted most of all was God. What's driven into your soul and mine? You want happiness, inner peace? God first, others second, you last. Love people, use things, not the other way around.